3 stones. That's the currency this story opens with. Not silver, not tribute, not heroism. 3 stones. 1 thrown in a debate hall, 1 thrown at a doorway, 1 thrown into the future as a vote. Viewer discretion advised. Because in 479 BCE, Greece does not begin with a glorious last stand. It begins with a democracy discovering how easy it is to turn disagreement into execution. And the big question we're going to drag through dust and ash is simple and ugly. When a free people is cornered, does it defend liberty? Or does it learn the empire's language, turning pain into policy and calling it salvation? If you value the historical record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. Picture the island of Salamis. Athens is not a city right now. It's a fleet and a crowd of refugees with smoke still in their lungs. Their homes have been burned. Their temples have been smashed. Their dead are unburied or scattered into rubble. The war has taught them a lesson no philosopher can soften. Mercy is expensive when your enemy can afford to return. So when a man named Lycidas stands in an assembly and says what logic would say, listen to the Persian offer, consider the terms. He doesn't get refuted, he gets erased. Not by a tyrant, not by secret police, by his peers. Herodotus tells it plainly. The councillors surround him and stone him to death on the floor. Then the violence spreads like a law with no judge. The women of Athens, hearing the uproar, don't ask for evidence. They don't ask what was promised. They march to Lycidas's house, drag out his wife and children, and stone them too. This is not barbarism versus civilization. This is civilization under anesthesia, numb enough to call murder hygiene. Now understand what that moment is doing politically. It's not just rage, it's a signal. A public policy announcement made with rocks. Diplomacy is treason, survival requires unanimity. The cost of dissent is extinction. Once a crowd performs that kind of violence, it becomes complicit. Because if peace ever becomes acceptable again, then what they did becomes unforgivable. So they cannot allow peace to be acceptable. That is how trauma becomes law. And that is why the battlefield of Plataea is already built before a single spear is leveled. Xerxes has left Greece, yes, but he leaves behind Mardonius, the sharper blade, a commander who understands that you don't have to conquer a people if you can force them to break themselves. Athens has been burned once, and then again, not because fire is tactically necessary, but because ash is psychological. Ash tells refugees, even if you win, there is nothing to go home to. So the Greek alliance forms in the only way frightened coalitions ever form, not through love, but through a shared terror of the alternative. Sparta delays, calculating its own risk. Athens threatens, calculating its own survival. And between them is the hidden machinery that the victory songs won't mention: food, water, and the bodies that will carry both. Because the next heroic march you've heard about, it won't be paid in courage, it will be paid in logistics, in armed servants, in coerced feet, in a column moving north, dragging a society's contradictions behind it like chains. And when that column finally arrives at the edge of Boeotia and looks down onto the Persian camps, the Greeks will discover the real horror. The enemy isn't only across the river. The enemy is inside the alliance, inside the fear, inside the rules they've already decided they must obey to deserve the name free. Athens did not recover after Salamis. Athens dispersed. A city without walls becomes a nervous system. All pain, no skin. The people were packed onto Salamis and the nearby coast, breathing salt air that couldn't wash the smoke out of their throats. They could see their own skyline across the water, except it wasn't a skyline anymore. It was a smear of broken stone and scorched timbers, a reminder that victory at sea does not stop a man on horseback from burning your life twice. And that is exactly what Mardonius understood. Xerxes went home. The empire did not. It left behind the kind of commander empires rely on when the easy pageantry is over, the administrator of terror. Mardonius didn't need to beat Athens in a single glorious clash. He needed Athens to feel the truth that makes populations bargain. You can't protect your children with principles. You protect them with outcomes. If outcomes require surrender, many people will learn to call surrender wisdom. So the Persians offered terms again, not because they believed Athens deserved mercy, but because diplomacy is a weapon ball. When your enemy is starving, homeless, and politically divided. In Herodotus's telling, the message comes with a smooth tongue and a practical promise. Restore Athens, spare the people, make them friends of the great king. Think about the psychology of that offer. It isn't a bribe, it's a wedge. If Athens accepts, the Greek alliance collapses. If Athens refuses, Athens stays ash. Either way, Mardonius profits. This is where the story gets uncomfortable for anyone raised on the bedtime version of Greek unity. The alliance was not a choir singing in harmony. It was a negotiation with knives hidden under the table. Athens had the navy, the only thing that could keep the Persians from returning by sea. Sparta had the land prestige, the myth of the hoplite, and the discipline that made other Greeks follow. But myths don't feed refugees. Myths don't rebuild temples. And myths don't stop cavalry from riding through your fields. So Athens did what cornered states do. It turned moral clarity into leverage. Envoys were sent to Sparta with a message that did not sound like humble pleading. It sounded like a contract being renegotiated at spear point. You want us to keep fighting? Then fight with us. Because if you don't march, if you sit behind your defenses and let Attica burn again, don't be surprised when we do what survival demands and take the Persian deal. That isn't treachery in the simple cartoon sense. It's the logic of abandonment. When you ask a people to die for a coalition, you don't get to leave them homeless and call their desperation a sin. And Sparta was stalling. You can dress it up as piety or tradition or waiting for the right moment, but the shape of it is familiar. Delay as policy. Sparta was fortifying the isthmus, thinking like a city that can afford to trade other people's land for time. If the Persians stayed north, fine. If Athens burned, tragic. But the Peloponnese might hold. This is how alliances rot. Not from open betrayal, but from quiet calculations about whose suffering is tolerable. The Athenians' threat forced the calculation into the open. Sparta could not let Athens drift. Not because Sparta suddenly discovered compassion, but because the moment Athens becomes Persian-friendly, the sea becomes Persian again, and the walls of the isthmus turn from shield into coffin. A Peloponnesian fortress is useless if an empire can land behind it. So the Spartan machine finally moved. And when Sparta moves, it does not do it with speeches. It does it with a receipt. Herodotus gives us the numbers like an invoice stamped in blood. 5,000 Spartiates, the full citizen core, and 5,000 other Lacedaemonians, with helots assigned in a ratio that makes the moral math impossible to ignore. 7 helots per Spartan, 35,000 coerced bodies, attached to 5,000 free warriors, like shadows that can bleed. Add allied contingents, Tegeans, and others. And what leaves the Peloponnese is not just an army. It is a society in motion, complete with its hierarchy, its exploitation, and its denial. This is the moment the heroic myth likes to freeze frame. Red cloaks marching north, shields shining, the earth trembling under disciplined feet. But if you're honest, you have to look at the column from the side. You have to see the men whose names won't be sung, the helots carrying gear, hauling food, running messages, throwing stones and javelins with cheaper armor and worse odds. You have to see how freedom is being defended by dragging an enslaved underclass into the arrow storm first. And now imagine the Athenian envoys waking up in Sparta expecting more excuses, only to learn the army has already slipped away in the night. There's a cold genius to that. Sparta doesn't argue. Sparta doesn't promise. It acts, then forces everyone else to catch up emotionally to what has already been done. Action as dominance, logistics as rhetoric. But here is the turn that makes this story dangerous. The moment Sparta marches, Mardonius gets what he wanted. Heavy infantry leaving the hills, a coalition finally moving where cavalry can profit, a war about to shift from speeches and offers into terrain, water, and panic. Because down in Boeotia, across a river and under the summer sun, Mardonius isn't waiting to be defeated. He's waiting to make the Greeks pay for every step forward. And the first bill he plans to collect won't be measured in dead men. It will be measured in thirst. If you grew up on the pop culture Persian Wars, you were sold a simple moral geometry, a small band of free Greeks versus an endless, faceless Eastern swarm. It makes for clean cinema. It also makes for bad history and worse politics, because it teaches you to mistake propaganda for reality. Mardonius was not leading a mindless horde. By the time Plataea becomes possible, the Persian force left in Greece is the residue of a much larger expedition. What remains after winter, attrition, and strategic withdrawal. Ancient sources inflate numbers the way victorious coalitions always do, because big enemies make your victory feel deserved. Modern historians argue about the scale. What matters is the shape. A combined arms army with cavalry strong enough to punish slow infantry, archers disciplined enough to deny open ground, and command staff experienced in turning Greek strengths into liabilities. And that is why the Spartan mobilization matters as more than a marching anthem. It's a ledger entry. What a state is willing to spend when the cost of delay finally looks higher than the cost of blood. Herodotus gives the Spartan contribution in a way that strips the romance out of it. 5,000 Spartiates, not 10,000 Spartans, not a mythic round number, but the citizen soldier corps. Alongside them, 5,000 other Lacedaemonians. And then the part the hero stories whisper, 7 helots per Spartan, 35,000 coerced men dragged along as attendants and light troops. Not volunteers, not equals. A war for Greek freedom marching on a foundation of slavery. That ratio is not an accident of logistics. It's political architecture. Sparta's system depends on controlling a massive unfree population. That control is normally maintained by keeping helots disarmed, watched, and afraid. But here, Sparta does something that looks like trust and is actually desperation. It takes them to war. Think about the contradiction. The state that fears its own labor force more than any foreign king now needs those same bodies to carry its food, its tents, its weapons, its wounded, its entire ability to project power beyond the Peloponnese. This is how empires and free societies alike reveal themselves in crisis. They spend the lives they were already spending quietly, just faster and in public. The column moves north, and everywhere it passes, it drags a message behind it. We have finally decided whose land is allowed to burn. Because up until now, the war could be framed as Athens' misfortune, a northern disaster that the Peloponnese could wall off. Once Sparta marches, that fiction dies. The war becomes pan-Hellenic, not because of shared ideals, but because the math changes. If Athens falls to Persian diplomacy, Sparta loses its naval shield. If Sparta refuses to fight, Athens loses its homeland. Mutual dependence replaces pride. Meanwhile, Mardonius does what a competent commander does when he hears heavy infantry is coming. He chooses the battlefield before they arrive. He abandons the temptation to treat Athens as a stage. He doesn't want his army pinned inside ruins where hoplites can force close combat. So, he withdraws into Boeotia, toward Plataea, and sets his camp by the Asopus. This isn't a retreat, it's a purchase. He buys space. Space for cavalry to move, space for archers to shoot, space for Greek formation to become a burden rather than a weapon. The Greek phalanx is terrifying when it hits you square. The phalanx is also slow, thirsty, and dependent on cohesion. A commander like Mardonius doesn't need to defeat courage. He needs to break coordination. So, he fortifies. Herodotus describes a Persian stockade, a defended base, wood, earthworks, a secure place to fall back to if the open plain turns against him. That single detail should change how you picture the Persians. This is not an army that expects a single cinematic clash to decide history. This is an army preparing to manage risk, hold supply, and survive the unpredictable stupidity of battle. That is the difference between a raid and an occupation. You build a place to return to. Then the Greeks arrive and do the only intelligent thing they can do. They refuse the purchase. From the foothills of Titharon, they look down on the Persian camp and see what the plain costs. Down there is where cavalry can circle like sharks. Down there is where archers can fire without being forced into a shove match. Down there is where your dead become spread out and uncountable. The kind of killing that breaks morale because it feels like weather. So the Greek commanders, with Pausanias at the Spartan side, keep the line on the high ground. They anchor themselves to rock, not because rock is noble, but because rock is a shield against mobility. And this is the real opening duel of Plataea. Not spear versus spear, but patience versus logistics. Day after day, both sides stare. The Persians won't climb into terrain that cancels their cavalry advantage. The Greeks won't descend into a field designed to tax their armor and punish their slowness. Under that stalemate is a brutal truth. Armies don't just fight each other. They fight the clock. They fight water. They fight food. They fight discipline. The side that can keep its coalition intact longer usually wins, not because it's braver, but because it can pay the costs longer. Mardonius understands that. So, he begins where every smart commander begins when facing heavy infantry that refuses to come down: harassment. Not to win a battle in an afternoon, but to unmake the enemy's decision-making. Hit their outposts. Pin their allies. Create shame. Create impatience. Make someone in the coalition crack and move at the wrong time. And the coalition gives him the perfect target. Not the Spartans, too disciplined, too proud to admit pain. The weaker contingents, the men who can't afford to stand under insult while the great cities debate. You don't fracture an alliance by attacking the strongest link. You fracture it by bleeding the nervous ones until they demand a different plan. Soon, the Persian cavalry will ride close enough for the Greeks to hear laughter. Soon, arrows will start landing where bronze can't cover. Soon, one Persian commander, loved by his men, dressed like wealth on horseback, will push the harassment too far. And when he falls, the Greeks will think they've won something. The question is, will that first blood steady the coalition, or will it tempt them off the rocks and down into the plain? Mardonius bought for them. The battlefield at Plataea is not a place, it is a pricing model. From the Greek ridge on Citharon, the plain below looks harmless, flat, sun-bleached, wide enough to fit every fantasy of heroic collision. But flat ground is not neutral ground. Flat ground is a business plan for cavalry. It turns speed into profit and slowness into debt. And Mardonius chose it the way a lender chooses a desperate borrower. Not because it guarantees a quick victory, but because it guarantees the Greeks will bleed interest with every day they remain undecided. The Greeks stayed high. They hugged rough slopes and broken stone because rock is the only honest ally a hoplite has against horses. Bronze and discipline win you the shove match when you can force contact. But horses let the enemy decide when contact happens, and how long you have to stand there while arrows teach your body that courage doesn't stop dehydration. This is where the myth of Greek freedom starts to look like a coordination problem. Because there isn't one Greek army. There are dozens of city-states with different fears, different time horizons, different thresholds for pain. Sparta can tolerate humiliation longer because it built its identity on suffering. Athens can tolerate risk because its life is afloat, its navy, its walls to be rebuilt, its future. But smaller allies, men from Megara, Corinth, and Boeotia, they don't have the luxury of symbolic patience. They have farms, families, and politics at home. Every day they stand on that ridge, the coalition is paying wages in anger. Mardonius reads that like a seasoned manipulator. He doesn't try to drag Spartans down the hill by force. He tries to make the alliance argue itself down. He sends cavalry, not to win, but to edit the Greek mood. The harassment begins like ritual humiliation. Persian horsemen ride up, loose arrows wheel away. They don't need to kill many. They just need to prove the Greeks are trapped in their own caution. They circle like they own the air. They shout insults because insults are strategic. When your enemy's pride is a fragile structure holding together a frightened coalition. Every arrow that lands is a reminder. Your armor makes you slow. Your formation makes you predictable. Your caution makes you stationary targets. This is what logistics looks like from the inside. Not spreadsheets, but men staring at the same ridge, watching the same dust, feeling the same sun, and realizing the enemy is choosing the rhythm of their suffering. And then, inevitably, the weakest point starts to buckle. Herodotus places the Megarians in the line where they are most exposed, pinned by cavalry pressure. You can almost hear the politics forming. Where is Sparta's famous discipline now? Where is Athens' cleverness? When an ally starts taking disproportionate casualties, the alliance stops being an idea and becomes an argument. Men don't mutiny because they're cowards. They mutiny because they can't explain to themselves why they're the ones paying today's bill. So they send word up the line, "Help us, or we leave." Now, watch what the coalition does under stress. Not heroic unity, bargaining, calculation, reputation management. Pausanias, the Spartan regent holding the command, has to respond, not only because men are dying, but because if one contingent walks away, the entire Greek line becomes a row of missing teeth. A phalanx is not brave individuals, it is geometry. Remove blocks, and the whole design fails. A small force goes down to meet cavalry. On terrain, cavalry prefers. It is, on paper, the kind of move commanders avoid because it invites disaster. But the Greeks are learning a new truth in real time. Sometimes you have to spend lives to purchase cohesion. In the skirmish that follows, the war hands them a gift that feels like providence and functions like propaganda. Mecistius falls. He is not just any officer. In Herodotus, he is a figure of stature and status, a man whose presence matters to Persian morale. When his horse is wounded and he hits the ground, the Greeks swarm him. And here the story briefly becomes technical, almost embarrassingly physical. They struggle to kill him because armor is not an aesthetic. It is an economic technology. It's a portable wall. It turns the enemy's effort into wasted energy. A man in good armor can force his killers to improvise, to find the one unpriced weakness, the eye slit, the gap, the hinge. So they do. A spear point finds what bronze and linen can't cover, and Mecistius dies. And the effect is immediate. The Persian cavalry surges forward to recover the body, and the Greeks fight like men who have been insulted for days and finally found a way to answer. They hold. They drag the corpse back as a trophy. They parade it, because ancient war is always two wars, one of bodies, one of meaning. For the Greeks, Mecistius's body becomes proof that the Persians are not invincible. For the Persians, it becomes proof that this campaign is not a clean occupation. Someone important can die, the aura can be punctured, but here is the trap inside the triumph. First blood is addictive. It makes the Greeks forget why they stayed on the ridge. It makes them believe morale can replace water. It makes them feel that the enemy's mobility can be handled. And that is exactly how commanders like Mardonius win. Not by outmuscling you, but by letting you misread your own luck as a turning tide. Because the sun is still climbing, the plain is still flat. The horses are still thirsty-proof compared to men sealed in bronze. And the Greeks are still a coalition, still a room full of different fears pretending to be one will. Masistius's death ends the staring contest, not because it changes the physics, but because it changes the psychology. It convinces the Greeks that they can afford to move. It convinces some of them that waiting is cowardice. It convinces others that retreat is shame. And once an alliance begins making decisions to satisfy pride instead of survival, it becomes predictable. Mardonius doesn't need to attack immediately. He just needs to wait for the Greeks to step off the rock and start shopping for water. And they will. Killing Masistius didn't change the map. It changed the mood. For a moment, the ridge feels less like a cage. Men who have spent days swallowing dust and insults finally have a body to point at and say, "See, steel can bleed." The coalition breathes. The weaker contingents stop talking about leaving. The commanders stop talking about endurance and start talking about momentum. And that is exactly the kind of emotional shift that turns a defensive position into a slow suicide. Because the war isn't waiting for your morale to catch up. The war is counting your water. Herodotus tells us it is high summer. You can feel that sentence if you've ever stood on stone in August. Heat rising from the ground like breath from an animal. Now, trap that heat under bronze. A hoplite's armor is protection, yes, but it's also a tax you pay every minute you wear it. It taxes your lungs. It taxes your skin. It taxes your ability to stand still without panicking. Against cavalry and archers, you can endure a lot, until dehydration turns discipline into hallucination. Pausanias can see the problem forming inside the line. High ground protects you from horses, but high ground doesn't always feed you. Water becomes the real terrain. It always does. Spears decide the story only after springs and streams have decided what is possible. So the Greeks do something that looks like taking the initiative, and is really just moving their throat closer to the enemy's hand. They shift down from the safest foothills toward the river system, seeking reliable water, seeking a position that can hold an army without killing it from the inside. In some retellings, the focus becomes the Gargaphia spring, that single fragile artery of clear water that can keep thousands alive. Whether it's that spring alone or a cluster of sources in the area, the principle is the same. The coalition is reorganizing around thirst. And the moment they do, Mardonius stops playing the insult game and starts playing the strangulation game. A lesser commander sees hoplites moving and thinks, finally, charge them, win the clash. Mardonius understands something colder. He doesn't need to break Greek shields if he can break Greek logistics. An army is a mouth. If you can keep it hungry and dry, it will bite itself. So the Persian cavalry rides, not straight into the phalanx where bronze can make a wall, but around it, into the spaces the phalanx cannot cover. The mountain passes, the tracks that bring grain, the routes where oxen and drivers move at the speed of honest labor, not at the speed of war. This is the part the heroic version can't stomach, because it's not glorious. It's predatory accounting. Horsemen intercept what the Greeks rely on to keep standing there: food convoys, pack animals, drivers, carts. The competitor script gives an exact number: hundreds of wagons, because modern storytelling loves the clarity of a digit. Ancient sources are rarely that neat, but the effect is not in doubt. Persian cavalry disrupts supply, drivers get killed, animals get taken or slaughtered. The line between holding position and starving in place vanishes. Now watch what happens to a coalition when the enemy turns warfare into rationing. The Spartans can command silence. They can forbid men from breaking formation. They can punish cowardice with shame. But a commander cannot shame thirst out of a throat. A commander cannot whip a spring into producing more water. Discipline keeps your line from dissolving in panic, until the body revolts and forces panic anyway. Days pass. The stalemate becomes a furnace. Persian riders appear, loose volleys withdraw. Every hit is a reminder. The Greeks are paying in blood without being allowed to pay back. For the men under those arrows, strategy begins to feel like a word rich men use to explain why poor men die slowly. And inside the Greek camp, the alliance begins to argue, in the way all alliances argue when resources tighten. Everyone's plan is rational, and every rational plan makes someone else's survival impossible. Athens, built on ships and improvisation, leans toward bold action, hit the Persians, force a decision, stop the harassment. Others want retreat, pull back to safer ground, regroup, avoid the plain. Sparta resists both instincts because Sparta is not only commanding an army here, Sparta is performing an identity. To step backward looks like admitting the Persian cavalry has rewritten the rules of Greek courage. Mardonius sees the argument forming and applies pressure exactly where pressure matters. Not on the Spartans' shields, but on the coalition's patience. He doesn't have to destroy the phalanx. He just has to make the Greeks choose between dishonor and dehydration. This is why the Persians keep their cavalry active. Not because arrows alone will annihilate hoplites, but because arrows, day after day, under heat, under hunger, turn "we are united" into "who is making us suffer?" And then the war makes its next move, one that proves how modern Mardonius's thinking really is. He looks past the men and targets the infrastructure of life. He aims not for a glorious breakthrough, but for the quiet collapse of a water source. A spring is easier to ruin than an army is to kill. A spring can be turned into mud in an hour. An army can take days. The Greeks don't fully understand what is coming yet. They still talk like soldiers. Attack, retreat, honor, shame. But the battle is already shifting into something more humiliating, a contest over who gets to drink. And when the Persian horses finally turn toward the Greeks' water, the coalition will learn the rule that decides most wars. You can endure fear. You can endure insult. You can even endure casualties. But you cannot negotiate with thirst. The cavalry didn't come to win a heroic duel. It came to ruin a faucet. When Persian horsemen finally bypassed the Greek front and rode toward the water source, it wasn't the kind of attack that makes statues or poems. It was vandalism with strategic intent, an act so petty in form that it looks almost beneath the dignity of great war, and so catastrophic in effect that it exposes what war really is: control of the conditions that keep human beings functioning. Herodotus preserves the core horror. The Greek army's position depended on access to water. That meant springs. Small, vulnerable, finite points where an entire coalition's biology converged. So the Persians did what mobile forces always do to heavy infantry. They attacked the artery, not the muscle. Horses trampled, hooves churned earth. Clear water turned to slurry, mud and silt mixed into something you can't drink without vomiting it back up. In a matter of hours, thousands of men wearing bronze became a single organism with a single sensation, thirst. And thirst changes what discipline means. Earlier, the Greek coalition had been a political problem held together by fear of Persia. Now it becomes a physiological problem held together by the promise of water. You can rally men around liberty for a day. You can rally them around revenge for a week. But when your tongue cracks, and your urine turns dark, and your throat feels like it's lined with ash, your politics become simple. Drink, drink or die. This is where the alliance begins to fracture, in a way that has nothing to do with cowardice and everything to do with responsibility. Every city-state in that line is asking the same question. If we stay here one more day, will my men die for someone else's pride? The Athenians, watching their second city burn and their people live on boats, want a decisive fight, not because they love blood, but because delay looks like slow annihilation. The Corinthians, the Megarians, the smaller contingents look at the plain and see cavalry profit and hoplites bleed. They want out, not because they don't believe in the cause, but because the cause is starting to feel like a slogan painted over a funeral. And Sparta does what it always does under pressure. It tries to hold the line with silence. But silence in a coalition is not neutral. Silence is control. Silence is the attempt to impose one city's psychology on everyone else's biology. Pausanias sits in the center of this storm like a man trying to keep a rope from snapping. He is not only fighting Mardonius, he is fighting the logic of alliance collapse. Because if the coalition breaks, the Persians don't even need to win a battlefield. They simply wait for Greece to disassemble itself into separate survival deals. That's the empire's favorite victory. The enemy submits in pieces and calls it pragmatism. So, Pausanias makes the kind of decision that commanders make when they run out of good options. He chooses a dangerous option that at least restores choice. A tactical withdrawal at night. In daylight, a retreat looks like defeat. In daylight, cavalry turns a moving line into a massacre. But at night, with silence and coordination, a withdrawal can be a repositioning, an attempt to find defensible ground closer to the mountain and closer to reliable water. In the sources, the destination becomes a place remembered by a name that sounds almost mocking: the island. A patch of ground that isn't an island at all, but is safer, nearer to water, nearer to the slopes where horses can't simply circle and harvest you. On paper, it is rational. That's the cruel part. It's rational in the same way all desperate maneuvers are rational. The alternative is worse. But Pausanias' plan depends on the one thing this coalition has been bleeding out since Salamis: trust. It requires that every contingent move at the same time, in the same direction, without panicking, without making noise, without misreading shadows, without assuming the others are betraying them. It requires discipline, not as Spartan theatre, but as a shared practice across cities that don't even like each other. And it must happen within a narrow window, late enough that Persian scouts won't notice immediately, early enough that dawn won't catch them mid-march on open ground. This is what the heroic version never wants to admit: the fate of Western civilization, if you want to call it that, comes down to whether thousands of tired men can execute a nighttime traffic plan. And look at what Mardonius has achieved without winning a battle. He has used cavalry not just to kill, but to force Greek leadership into a move that risks turning their own army into scattered, isolated pockets. He has taken a coalition that was cautious and made it desperate. He has made water the clock, and the Greeks are now racing it. Now, imagine the camp as the order is passed. Men quietly rolling up bedding. Shields being lifted with care so bronze doesn't clink. Animals hushed. Officers whispering threats and prayers. Not the cinematic roar of war, just the small sounds of fear trying not to be heard. Because everyone there understands the real danger. If this retreat goes wrong, it won't be remembered as a smart repositioning. It will be remembered by the Persians as a rout. And a rout is the one gift heavy infantry cannot survive. At the second watch of the night, the coalition is supposed to move. The question is not whether the plan is clever. The question is whether a coalition built on trauma, pride, and unequal sacrifice can coordinate in darkness, while the enemy is only a river away, listening. Night is supposed to hide you, but in war, night also hides the truth from you, especially the truth about whether your allies are still allies. The order goes out, withdraw in silence, regroup near safer ground, find water before thirst turns discipline into mutiny. On paper, it is the kind of maneuver that looks almost elegant. Move the whole line at once, deny the Persians a clean target, reset the fight on terrain that punishes cavalry. But paper is what leaders love when reality is unbearable. Paper doesn't sweat. Paper doesn't panic. Paper doesn't hear the rustle of 1,000 men and imagine it's an enemy charge. As the coalition starts to move, the first crack appears where it always appears in alliances under stress. The middle, the center contingents. Men from cities that don't get the glory songs. Men who have already taken the harassment and the casualties while the great powers argued. Don't execute a controlled withdrawal. They run, not because they are uniquely cowardly, but because they are uniquely exposed. They have been taught by Persian cavalry that staying in place means dying slowly. They have been taught by the ruined spring that leadership will let biology become a bargaining chip. So, when the signal comes, they interpret it the way desperate people interpret any permission to move, as permission to escape. They don't stop at the agreed position. They keep going, all the way toward Plataea itself, huddling around the sanctuary near the temple of Hera. In the dark, half the coalition has effectively removed itself from the battle, not by betrayal, but by fear's most predictable instinct. Put walls between your body and uncertainty. This is the moment the heroic myth dies if you're brave enough to look at it. Because Greece is not moving like one will. Greece is moving like a crowd. And crowds do not move by logic. They move by contagion. Now picture what that does to the geometry of the line. A phalanx is a machine that depends on continuity. Shield to shield, unit to unit, city to city. When the center evaporates, you don't have a line anymore. You have fragments. And fragments invite cavalry, the way blood invites flies. On the left, the Athenians are trying to move in coordination, but the terrain breaks sightlines and distance, makes trust into a rumor. They cannot see the Spartan right clearly. They can't know, in the dark, whether they are withdrawing together or being abandoned. And in coalition warfare, the feeling of being abandoned is often deadlier than the fact of it, because it forces men to choose between dying alone or retreating selfishly. It forces officers to stop thinking like commanders and start thinking like parents. On the right wing, where Sparta stands, the crack comes from the opposite direction. Not fear. Pride. Here steps forward one of the most dangerous kinds of men a state can produce. The man who believes the myth is more important than survival. In the tradition preserved by Herodotus, a Spartan commander named Amompharetus refuses to move. To him, any backward step is disgrace. The distinction between tactical withdrawal and cowardly flight is academic nonsense, the kind of wordplay civilians invent to excuse shame. He has been trained from childhood to treat retreat as a moral violation. And now, in the one moment retreat might save the army, his identity sabotages the plan. The argument isn't just personal, it's ideological. Sparta's discipline works because it turns obedience into religion. But religion has an edge. It can become rigid at the exact moment flexibility is required. Amompharetus rejects orders not because he is undisciplined, but because he believes he is the only one being truly disciplined. Disciplined to the story Sparta tells itself about what a Spartan is. He makes it theatrical, because ideology always does. He casts a vote with a stone, mocking the language of civic decision-making while turning it into a weapon against his commander. It's almost absurd if you detach it from context. But, in context, it's lethal. While the coalition is trying to vanish into darkness, the Spartan right wing is frozen by an internal debate about honor. This is the political psychology of command laid bare. Armies do not collapse only under enemy pressure. They collapse under conflicting definitions of what shame means. For Athens, shame is abandonment. For Sparta, shame is retreat. For smaller allies, shame is dying for someone else's pride. Mardonius doesn't need to invent these contradictions. He just needs to press on them until they split. Pausanias tries to salvage it. He argues, he pleads, he threatens. But he is trapped in a paradox. He cannot allow a Spartan unit to remain behind. Yet, he also cannot afford to turn the disagreement into violence. Because the moment Spartans start fighting Spartans, the coalition's fragile faith in Spartan leadership dissolves. And that faith is one of the few currencies keeping the Greek alliance intact. So, he makes the only move left. He leaves. He orders the main Spartan body to begin withdrawing, hoping that when Amompharetus realizes he is truly being abandoned, truly about to face the Persians alone, he will follow. It is a gamble made out of exhaustion, a game of chicken played with thousands of lives. And it works, partly. Amompharetus finally moves. But the sky is already lightening. Dawn is not a clock in war, it is a verdict. Dawn reveals shapes. Dawn turns shadows into targets. Dawn tells the enemy exactly where your disorganized column is strung out along a ridge. No longer a wall, not yet a formation. Just men walking with their backs half turned. Across the river, Persian scouts see what looks like everything Mardonius has been buying with cavalry pressure and water sabotage. A broken coalition. The center missing. The Athenians separated. The Spartans stretched in a long line, with a lagging unit trailing like a loose thread begging to be pulled. And Mardonius reads it the way predators read motion, not as a controlled withdrawal, but as panic. This is the point where a campaign becomes a battle, because the enemy doesn't need perfect intelligence, only a believable story. And at dawn, the story the Persians see is irresistible. The Greeks are running. Mardonius does what commanders do when they think the gods have handed them an opening. He doesn't wait for a tidy plan. He doesn't wait to dress chaos in ceremony. He attacks. The dust rises. The cavalry surges toward the ridge. The archers and infantry pour forward behind them, hungry for a rout, hungry for the kind of victory that doesn't require shoving bronze head on. And Pausanias, hearing the thunder and turning to see the horizon filling with movement, realizes the truth too late. Their retreat has become the battle. The question now isn't whether the Greeks can win on good terrain. It's whether they can stop being a frightened crowd long enough to become a machine again, while arrows are already on their way. At dawn, the gods don't whisper. They expose you. The light comes up behind Citharon like a blade sliding out of a sheath, and suddenly there is nowhere to hide the truth. The Greek line is no longer a line. It is a set of separated bodies pretending they're still an army. The center has fled toward Plataea and curled up around sacred ground like frightened children. The Athenians are displaced on the far side, hemmed by hills and distance. And the Spartans, the supposed anchor of the coalition, are strung out mid-march, a long red thread laid across open slopes, not yet locked into the wall of shields that made Thermopylae a legend. Mardonius doesn't need perfect intelligence. He needs a story he can act on. And the story Dawn gives him is intoxicating. They are breaking. So the Persians move. First, the cavalry surges, fast, loud, confident, a wave designed to turn hesitation into panic. Behind them comes the infantry and archers, not in some clean parade formation, but with the hungry momentum of an army that thinks it has caught its prey running. In every era, this is when massacres happen, not when two armies meet at equal readiness, but when one side believes the other is already defeated. Pausanias hears it before he sees it. A low rumble, then a roar, then the sound that tells every soldier on earth the same truth. Too many feet, too close, too fast. He turns and looks backward into the rising dust, and he understands instantly what the retreat has become. Not a maneuver, a trap that has sprung. Now watch the decision that turns this battle into something almost unbearable to imagine. The natural human reflex under sudden attack is movement. Charge or flee. Either one at least feels like agency. But Pausanias does neither. He orders the Spartans to halt, to stop walking, to stop drifting, to become, again, a machine. Shields down, knees bent, bodies lowered. An emergency attempt to reassemble discipline in the exact moment discipline is hardest. When arrows start arriving before you've even chosen to fight. And then, because this is the ancient world, because power there does not only command bodies, but also commands meaning, he turns away from the enemy. He calls for a sacrifice. It sounds insane to modern ears, and that's the point. We think command is a purely rational act, see threat, respond with force. But Greek command contains a second layer of control, ritual permission. A general who violates the gods doesn't just risk battle, he risks legitimacy. If the coalition loses, his rivals will not say, bad luck, they will say, impiety. In a political system where blame is as lethal as spears, ritual is not superstition. It is insurance. So while Persian arrows thud into shields and clatter off bronze, a goat is dragged forward. Its throat is cut. Entrails are examined. The signs are wrong. Wait. Imagine what that does to men who have spent the night stumbling through broken coordination, who can taste dust on their teeth and feel sweat turning cold under armor. They kneel under a storm that keeps arriving in waves, arrows finding the gaps no shield can cover, the neck, the groin, the unarmored feet. Men scream because the pain is not cinematic. It's narrow and specific and intimate. Somewhere nearby, a helot, one of the 35,000 coerced bodies attached to Spartan freedom, crouches behind a wicker target or a scrap of hide and realizes he is being taxed by the same arrows as his master, but with cheaper protection. The empire does not discriminate when it collects. This is the moral ugliness at the center of Sparta's discipline. On the ridge, obedience looks like nobility, but from the perspective of the men beneath it, especially the unfree, it can look like a slow execution carried out in the name of order. The helots didn't come here to defend a constitution. They came because Sparta brought them. And now they are dying for the right to remain enslaved when the battle is over. A second goat. Again, the signs are wrong. Wait. Herodotus gives us the emblem of this cruelty in a single death. A Spartan named Callicrates, praised for beauty, struck down before the real clash begins. His frustration becomes the sentence that pierces the heroic narrative like a spear through linen. He does not mind dying for Greece. He minds dying without having struck a blow. That is the horror of ritual delay under arrow fire. It doesn't just kill you, it kills your story. It denies you the one consolation that war offers its victims, the illusion that your death was an act, not an accident. The Persian pressure tightens. Archers advance behind wicker screens, firing closer, more confident. Cavalry threatens the flanks, testing the line for cracks. The allies beside the Spartans, men who do not share the same religious rigidity, begin to twitch, ready to charge without permission, because suffering without response feels like humiliation, and humiliation breaks armies faster than casualties do. Pausanias holds them with the only thing he has left, authority. Not just authority over tactics, but authority over meaning. If they break formation and charge piecemeal, cavalry will peel them apart. If they run, the rout becomes real. So, he keeps them kneeling. He keeps them suffering. He forces the coalition to endure its own helplessness long enough to remain cohesive. And then comes the moment where the line between piety and calculation becomes impossible to separate. A third sacrifice. This time, the signs change. Now, whether the gods truly spoke, or whether Pausanias finally chose the moment when waiting had become more dangerous than charging, doesn't matter to the men bleeding on the rocks. What matters is what happens next. The kneeling statues stand. No speech, no poetry, just a spear raised. And when that spear lifts, the entire meaning of the morning flips. The hour of passive dying turns into stored violence. The frustration of hunger, the insult of arrows, the terror of retreat. Everything the Persians have been collecting as psychological tax is about to be paid back with interest. The Spartans surge forward. The question is not whether they will reach the Persian line. The question is what they will become when they do. The charge doesn't begin like a duel. It begins like a wall learning to move. When Pausanias raises the spear and the Spartans surge, the first seconds are not swordsmanship, they are mass. Bronze and oak and muscle converting fear into forward pressure. The Persians respond the way disciplined missile troops are trained to respond. They brace behind light defenses, wicker screens, planted shields, a quick barrier meant to keep arrows firing while the enemy hesitates. But the Greeks don't hesitate. That's the point of the hour they just endured. The waiting was a fuse. Now it detonates. The impact is not the clean clang of Hollywood. It's the sickening sound of light material failing under heavy momentum, wicker collapsing, poles snapping, bodies stumbling backward because physics doesn't care how brave you are. The Greeks called what follows an orthismos, a shove, and it's a brutal truth about hoplite warfare. Once the front ranks collide, you don't win by being a better individual fighter. You win by being a better collective weight, by staying locked, by stepping forward when your body screams to stop. Herodotus is clear about something modern propaganda tries to erase. The Persians fight hard. They are not whipped slaves. They don't melt at first contact. They grab spears with bare hands, wrenching and snapping shafts, trying to turn the Greek advantage, reach, into a liability. They surge with short weapons, trying to find gaps, trying to get inside the forest of points where bronze can't stab cleanly. Courage is there. Ferocity is there. What fails them is the mismatch between equipment and task. Because this is where war becomes an economic argument. The Persians are not soft because they enjoy luxury. They are light because their system values mobility, archery, cavalry, and flexible combined arms. Their protection, linen, leather, scale for some, works well in its own logic. But when a dense mass of armoured infantry forces a close shove match, the math turns cruel. Greek panoply, heavy shield, bronze helmet, cuirass, greaves, was expensive, punishing to wear and slow on the march. It is also exactly the kind of investment that pays off in this one narrow circumstance, face-to-face pressure where you can't be danced around. So the Persian line bends, not because they lack will, but because each Greek step forward is a lever, and the lever is reinforced with bronze. Spears splinter, men fall. The fight collapses inward, and now the short swords come out. What the Spartans trained for when the distance become intimate. The killing becomes closer than ideology. Shield rims crush faces. Blades look for throats. Someone slips in the blood and disappears under feet. And there is no time to mourn because the man behind you is pushing you forward whether you want to go or not. This is also where the hidden army finally appears, the helots. Earlier, they were the disposable edge of the coalition, dying under arrows with cheaper protection, absorbing the empire's tax with their skin. Now, as the main lines grind and gaps open, the helots flood into the seams like water finding cracks. Some throw stones, some jab with light spears, some finish wounded men crawling on the dirt. It's ugly to say, but it's true. The same exploited bodies Sparta drags to war become useful in the most intimate labor of victory. The state that denies them freedom still spends their violence. And in the center of this chaos is the one fact that ancient battlefields agree on across cultures. morale has a face. Mardonius is there, not watching like a distant king, but near enough that his presence matters. Sources describe him fighting from horseback, surrounded by picked men, an anchor war for Persian cohesion. As long as the soldiers can see the commander, the line holds, because belief holds. Belief is the cheapest armor an army has, and it's the first thing to fail when leadership disappears. The Greeks understand this instinctively. You don't have to kill every Persian. You have to kill the symbol that keeps them from running. So, the Greek pressure shifts. The line begins to grind toward the white horse, toward the purple cloak, toward the center where the Persians cluster like men protecting a beating heart. It is not elegant. It is predatory. It is an assassination attempt disguised as a battle. Herodotus preserves the result even when details blur. Mardonius falls. Some traditions say he is struck down by a man named Arimnestus of Plataea. Some accounts differ on whether it's a spear, a rock, or a crushing blow. That disagreement is not a weakness in the story. It's the fingerprint of battlefield chaos. What matters is the effect. The commander hits the ground and does not rise, and when he drops, the sound of the fight changes. You can feel the Persian line's confidence flicker, like a torch in wind. Ancient armies are not modern bureaucracies. They are living organisms of fear and momentum. Cut the head and the body panics. The Persians begin to give ground. Then they begin to run, not all at once, not as a clean order, but as the sudden spread of one man's decision. I am not dying here. This is where the coldest survival logic appears in the sources. Artabazus, commanding a substantial reserve, does not charge in to save the day. He watches, he measures, he decides the battle is no longer profitable, and he leads his men away, out of Greece, choosing survival over loyalty. That one decision tells you something the hero versions never will. Empire is not defeated only by courage. It is defeated when enough commanders decide the cost is not worth the outcome. Leaderless and shrinking, the remaining Persian forces fall back toward their fortified camp. The wooden stockade meant to be safety. Men pour into it like water into a jar, slamming gates, climbing walls, believing structure can replace morale. Outside, the Greeks arrive at the barrier and hesitate for the first time since the charge. Spartans were trained to break men, not walls. For a moment, the victory hangs in an uncomfortable place. The enemy is trapped, but not yet finished. The coalition is exhausted, thirsty, furious, and now facing a problem that can't be solved by shoving harder. So here's the open loop that decides whether Plataea becomes salvation or something far darker. When you trap an enemy army inside a wooden cage after days of hunger and humiliation, do you still remember how to stop killing? A fortification is supposed to protect the defeated. At Plataea, it becomes a funnel. The Persians fall back into their stockade with the instinct every trapped army has ever had. If we can't hold the field, at least we can hold a wall. Wood and earth feel like certainty when morale is dissolving. Inside the enclosure are thousands of men packed tight. Infantry, attendants, wounded, officers, compressed into a space where panic multiplies because there's nowhere to put it. Outside the wall, the Greeks gather with the opposite instinct: finish it. Not because they've read a doctrine of total war, but because they have just lived through weeks where the enemy treated water like a weapon and diplomacy like bait. mercy, to them, now looks like a delayed death sentence. For a moment, the Spartans stall. This is one of those awkward details that makes the sources feel real. Sparta's genius is not engineering, it's disciplined violence in open combat. Walls are inconvenient. Walls require tools, ladders, coordinated assaults, the kind of work that looks suspiciously like labor. And Sparta does not romanticize labor. Sparta outsources it. So the stockade holds longer than the cinematic version wants it to. The Persians shoot down from the timber, buying time with arrows and height. Spartans below grow frustrated, pacing like wolves at a fence, dangerous, determined, but briefly denied the one kind of killing they trained for. Then, the Athenians arrive. Remember them? The left wing that spent the battle engaged with Greek collaborators, Thebans, and others aligned with Persia, rather than inside Sparta's shove match. They come now, not simply as extra bodies, but as a different kind of capability. Athens builds ships. Athens understands construction. Athens is used to solving problems with devices, not just discipline. In the story preserved by ancient tradition, the breach comes through engineering and persistence, tearing down sections, forcing an opening, creating a gap wide enough for an army's hatred to pour through. And once the gap exists, the war becomes something else. This is the moment textbooks often soften with euphemisms. The Persians were slaughtered. The Greeks took the camp. Those phrases are anesthesia. What they hide is the decision that makes Plataea morally radioactive, the refusal to treat surrender as a valid state. In the competitor script, it's described as extermination, no prisoners, no mercy. Ancient warfare often includes massacres, especially after prolonged frustration, especially when an enemy is hated and feared, especially when the victors believe survival depends on making the lesson unforgettable. The stockade turns the endgame into a trap, where bodies can't disperse. The crowding makes killing efficient. The heat, the thirst, the humiliation of waiting under arrows, everything the Greeks have endured becomes fuel. They are not just winning, they are purging the memory of being powerless. This is where we have to look at the political psychology, because it's the same mechanism that repeats across centuries. Violence becomes easier to justify once you can redefine it as prevention. The Greeks don't see men behind the wall as individuals anymore. They see a future event. They see the next invasion. They see the next burned city. They see the next peace offer that will split us. And when you see people as future threats rather than present humans, extermination feels like strategy. It feels like hygiene. It feels like safety. The irony is brutal. Earlier, the Athenians killed Lycidas and his family for suggesting diplomacy. Now, the Greeks kill trapped Persians because diplomacy has become psychologically impossible. Trauma has narrowed the definition of loyalty until it contains only one act: destroy the enemy completely. Inside the stockade, the Persians' courage can't find space to function. There is no open ground for cavalry, no room for archers to reset lines, no way to maneuver. The very fortification that promised protection now concentrates fear. Men jam against walls. Command structure collapses into screams. And the Greeks, entering through the breach, fight in the worst kind of close quarters, where a fall becomes suffocation, where a wound becomes a crowd stepping over you, where blood turns the dirt into a slick that drags you down. The competitor script gives extreme casualty numbers, as ancient sources often do. Modern historians treat those figures cautiously, but you don't need an exact count to understand the scale of the psychological event. The Persian expedition in Greece is effectively destroyed as a fighting force. The outcome is not simply tactical, it is existential. The empire loses its European spear tip. The Greeks survive. And then, like every victory that costs too much, the survivors look around and realize what else is in the room. They are standing in a palace. Mardonius's camp isn't a poor man's bivouac. It is imperial wealth packed into transportable form, fine textiles, gold and silver vessels, furniture, prestige objects that function as both comfort and political theatre. For men who have been eating sparingly, who have been sleeping on rock, who have been told that Spartan virtue means rejecting luxury, this is a hallucination made of metal and dye. War always ends with a second battle, the battle over meaning. Was this slaughter necessary defense, or something more? Was it justice, or appetite? The loot forces the question because loot is the most honest confession a victorious army can make. You don't take what you despise, you take what you want. And right here, in the wreckage and the treasure, Pausanias is about to stage a scene that becomes propaganda for centuries. The comparison between soft Persian luxury and hard Greek austerity. But here's the open loop that should make your stomach tighten before we enter that tent. If the Greeks just proved they can kill like an empire, what happens when they also learn to live like one? After the killing, the strangest weapon on the field wasn't a spear, it was a table. The Persian camp at Plataea wasn't just a military position, it was a mobile theatre of empire. Objects designed to make power look natural, gold and silver vessels, rich textiles dyed in colours that weren't fashion, but status. Furniture that told every visitor the same message. The world is ordered, and Persia sits at the top of it. An army that travels with that kind of wealth is not simply fighting. It is rehearsing domination wherever it goes. And now the Greeks stood inside it, covered in the grime of weeks that tasted like thirst. This is the moment where victory stops being about survival and becomes about identity. Because Greece doesn't just need to win. Greece needs to explain why it deserved to win. It needs a moral story large enough to cover the uglier parts. The mob killing at Salamis, the panic retreat, the slaughter inside the stockade. It needs a version of itself that can carry the weight of what it has done without collapsing into guilt. So, Pausanias stages a scene. Herodotus records it as a famous anecdote, but it functions like a manifesto. He orders the Persian cooks, men who know how to feed imperial power, to prepare a meal the way they would have prepared it for Mardonius. The tent fills with scents and textures that don't belong to a ridgeline. Roasted meats, soft breads, spices that imply trade routes and tax systems. Abundance that says the empire's reach is long enough to make luxury portable. Silver platters. Order. Comfort. Then Pausanias orders his own cooks to make a Spartan mess. Plain, harsh, familiar. The kind of food that doesn't flatter the senses because it is meant to flatter the soul. Lentils, rough fare, the kind of meal that tells you virtue is built from restraint. He places the two meals side by side like evidence in a trial. Then he calls the Greek commanders in to look, and he laughs. Men of Greece, the story goes, look at how they live, and yet they came here to take from us who have so little. In one gesture, Pausanias turns a battlefield into a moral classroom. The Persians become soft, decadent, greedy. The Greeks become hard, honest, poor, but free. It's a perfect story because it feels like it explains everything. Why they fought, why they suffered, why they killed. It also happens to be propaganda of extraordinary durability. This is the moment a whole later identity begins to take shape. The one we casually call East versus West, luxury versus virtue, empire versus freedom. And like most founding myths, it is built on selective vision. Pausanias is looking at Persian gold and calling it corruption, but he is standing in a camp taken by mass killing. He is using a feast to erase the moral cost of how the feast became available. Because this is the trick. Power loves. It doesn't deny violence. It reframes violence as purification. The Greeks didn't slaughter, they liberated. They didn't execute prisoners. They prevented the next invasion. They didn't panic and break. They tactically repositioned. And now, in Pausanias' tent, they don't see wealth. They see a sermon. We are different, therefore we are justified. But the human mind has another trick. What you mock often reveals what you want. The very act of laying Persian luxury next to Spartan austerity forces the Greek commanders to imagine the taste of empire. To imagine a life where power doesn't just mean holding a line under arrows, but eating well while others do the holding. In other words, victory doesn't end desire. Victory expands it. Around this same time, Greek tradition tells another story that feels almost supernatural. That on the very day Plataea is decided, Greek forces strike Persian remnants at Mycale across the sea, smashing what is left of Persian naval power in the Aegean. Whether it happened on the exact same calendar day or not, matters less than why the Greeks insisted it did. They wanted the war to end like a deliberate synchronized act, as if Greece, for one perfect afternoon, became a unified intelligence capable of delivering a double blow. That belief is psychologically important because it covers a fear. The alliance has been held together by emergency. Once Persia is pushed back, the emergency ends. And when the emergency ends, the alliance must find a new reason to exist, or it will turn its instruments inward. You can already see the outline of that future in the aftermath. Athens rebuilds with the confidence of a city that survived fire and learned the power of its fleet. Sparta returns home with the prestige of land victory and the myth of discipline. Both leave Plataea thinking the war proved something about their superiority. Both are right. And that is why they will eventually collide. But the darkest seed is planted not in Athens, not in the ships or the walls. It's planted in Pausanias himself, standing inside Mardonius's tent. He has just demonstrated, publicly, the performance of Spartan incorruptibility. He has turned austerity into a weapon. Yet the camp around him is full of things that Sparta pretends not to value, and every soldier, every commander, every ally can see them. War doesn't just reveal character. War offers character a bribe. And Pausanias, the man who held an army kneeling under arrows, will soon face a harder test than Persian cavalry. The invitation to become what he defeated. Because once you've won victory, you can start to believe you deserve more than your laws allow. So here is the turn that drags us into the last act. The Persians are gone, but the empire's real victory condition has just activated. It has exported its temptation. And the next question is not what Persia will do to Greece. The next question is what Greece will do to itself now that it has tasted the empire's table. Plataea ends the Persian War in Greece. It does not end the Persian War inside the Greek mind. The alliance returns south, carrying two kinds of spoils. The first is visible: metal, cloth, wealth, objects that can be melted, traded, displayed. The second is invisible: a new permission. The permission to believe that survival justifies anything. The permission to treat pain as proof of virtue. The permission to turn a crisis coalition into a permanent hierarchy. This is why the big question matters now. At the end, when the enemy is gone, when a free people is cornered, do they defend liberty? Or do they learn empire's language and call it salvation? Look at what the Greeks have learned. They learned mob law. At Salamis, an Athenian named Lycidas suggested listening to terms, and the assembly answered with stones, not argument. That wasn't a Persian act, that was a Greek act. A democracy discovering how quickly it can become a crowd and still call itself righteous. Once a society kills dissent in public, it has to keep killing the idea of dissent in private, because otherwise it must admit it committed murder. Trauma becomes policy because policy becomes self-justification. They learned logistics as violence. Mardonius showed them that you don't need to break a shield wall if you can poison the water that keeps it standing. You can starve an army without defeating it. You can make an alliance fracture simply by forcing it to argue about thirst. And what did the Greeks do in response? They didn't reject that logic. They adapted to it. They accepted that the war would be decided not only by courage, but by controlling conditions. Springs, passes, supply lines, timing. That is not evil. It's competence. But competence is morally neutral. It can serve defense today and domination tomorrow. They learned ritual as command technology. Pausanias kept men kneeling under arrow fire until the signs turned favorable. Whether you read that as piety or calculation, the function is the same. Ritual delayed action long enough to preserve formation. It turned terror into obedience. It taught an army that meaning can be enforced even while bodies die. That is power in its purest form. Not just telling people what to do, but telling them what their suffering means. And finally, they learned extermination as closure. After weeks of humiliation and deprivation, the Persians fled into the stockade and the Greeks broke in. Ancient sources celebrate the victory. The competitor script calls it what it felt like on the ground: slaughter. The coalition did not end the battle with a negotiated surrender. It ended it with a trapped killing. This is where the line between defense and vengeance turns into fog. It's also where freedom can become indistinguishable from the empire it claims to resist, because empires, too, prefer enemies who cannot return. So yes, Greece is saved in the narrow sense. The invasion is broken, the expedition destroyed, the threat retreats. But the method of salvation has a moral cost. And the cost doesn't vanish when the Persians do. It remains inside the winners, waiting for a new target. Athens is the first to realize what victory can buy. A city that once begged for help now rebuilds with ambition. Walls rise again, ships multiply, allies become partners, then become clients, then become tribute payers. The Delian League forms as a defensive alliance and begins to behave over time like an empire with better branding. Athens monetizes the reputation earned in 479 BCE. It turns survival into a revenue stream. The freedom it defended becomes the justification for controlling others for their own good. That's how ideology becomes a business model. Sparta responds the way Sparta always responds when it smells instability, with control. And the greatest threat Sparta can imagine is not Persia returning. It is its own underclass learning that the world can change. Which brings us back to Pausanias. Herodotus gives us the feast scene. Pausanias laughing at Persian luxury, performing Spartan austerity like a sermon. But history, in the long run, cares less about what a man says in victory than about what a man becomes afterward. And Pausanias becomes a warning. Ancient sources, especially Thucydides, preserve the outline of his fall. Suspicions that he Medized, that he adopted Persian manners, that he used foreign symbols of status, that he exchanged secret communications and imagined himself above the laws that made him. Even if you treat each detail cautiously, the shape is coherent. The victor of Plataea began acting like a man intoxicated by the very empire he had defeated. This is not just a personal scandal. It is political philosophy with a heartbeat, because it shows what victory does to a leader who has been granted extraordinary authority by emergency. In war, a commander is allowed to bend norms because survival demands it. After war, that commander sometimes believes he is still the exception. He starts treating laws as obstacles rather than foundations. And when a society is built on rigid hierarchy, as Sparta is, that kind of exception is not merely dangerous, it is existential. The story culminates in a scene that feels like ancient horror because it is the collision of law, ritual, and cruelty. Pausanias flees into a sanctuary, the temple of Athena of the Brazen House, claiming the protection of sacred space. In a world where killing inside a temple risks divine pollution, the Spartan authorities face a problem. They want him dead, but they want their hands clean. So they do what a society obsessed with purity often does. They outsource the violence to procedure. They wall him in. They seal the entrance. They turn sanctuary into a tomb while telling themselves they are respecting the gods. And in the most chilling version of the tradition, his own mother places the first stone, an image that compresses Sparta's values into one gesture: the state before the family, the system before the child. Pausanias dies not on a battlefield, but in a legal ritual trap, starved, denied, erased. And the final irony is almost too perfect. The man who used sacrifice to control an army is destroyed by a society using sacred law to control him. Now we can answer the big question, without comforting ourselves. When a free society is cornered, it doesn't automatically become nobler. It becomes more honest. It reveals what it is willing to do to survive. At Plataea, Greece survives by becoming capable of empire's tools: coordinated coercion, propaganda through spectacle, violence rationalized as prevention, and power disguised as virtue. The Persians did not lose because they were soft. They lost because their expedition became too costly to sustain once leadership fell and calculation replaced courage. The Greeks did not win because they were pure. They won because they endured, adapted, and then, when the door opened, killed without restraint. Plataea is not the clean story we repeat because it refuses to keep the heroes clean. Thermopylae is a beautiful defeat. The dead can't be corrupted. Plataea is an ugly victory. The living have to carry what they did. So, remember the 300 if you want symbols. But if you want reality, remember the kneeling under arrows, the ruined spring, the night retreat that shattered the alliance, the stockade that became a cage, and the feast that invented a moral story to hide the blood. Because when the ledger closes, the bones still speak. And they say this: salvation has a price, and the winners pay it too.